Imagine you are walking home late at night through a neighborhood where the streetlights have been broken for months, where the corner shop has shut down, where the youth center closed because of budget cuts, and where the police patrol only during daylight hours. Now ask yourself this: if a crime happens in that neighborhood tonight, whose fault is it really? Is it the fault of the individual who made a choice to commit that crime? Or is it the fault of a society that allowed that neighborhood to decay in the first place? This is not a simple question. In fact, it is one of the most profound and debated questions in the entire history of criminology, the scientific study of crime, its causes, and its consequences. And today, we are going to answer it. We are going to explore two of the most important and competing theories in modern criminology: left realism and right realism. These two schools of thought sit on opposite sides of the political and intellectual spectrum, yet both claim to be the most honest, the most realistic, and the most practical approach to understanding crime in the real world. By the end of this video, you will not only understand what each theory says, you will understand why it matters, how it plays out in real life, and how it shapes the criminal justice policies that affect millions of people every single day. Before we dive into the two specific theories, we need to understand why the word realism matters in criminology. For much of the 20th century, criminological theories were criticized for being either too idealistic or too abstract. On one hand, you had scholars on the political left who focused so heavily on grand structural critiques of capitalism and inequality that they almost lost sight of real victims suffering real harm in real communities. On the other hand, you had conservative thinkers who focused on moral decline and individual weakness, but whose solutions, more prisons, harsher punishments, often failed to reduce crime in any meaningful way. By the 1980s, a group of thinkers on both sides decided that it was time to get real, to stop theorizing in the abstract, and to actually confront crime as an urgent material problem that destroys lives, damages communities, and demands honest, evidence-based solutions. This movement gave birth to two parallel but opposing schools: left realism, pioneered primarily in Britain by scholars like Jock Young and Roger Matthews, and right realism, developed largely in the United States by thinkers like James Q. Wilson and Charles Murray. Both claimed to take crime seriously, but their diagnoses and their prescriptions could not have been more different. Right realism, sometimes called neoconservative criminology, begins with a deceptively simple premise: crime happens because individuals choose to commit it. That is the starting point. Right realists reject what they see as the soft-headed liberal tendency to always excuse criminal behavior by pointing to poverty, racism, or inequality. For the right realist, a person who breaks into your home is not primarily a victim of society. They are an individual who made a rational calculation and decided that the reward outweighed the risk. This perspective draws heavily from rational choice theory, which argues that human beings are fundamentally self-interested actors who weigh costs and benefits before taking action. The job of the criminal justice system, therefore, is not to heal society. It is to raise the cost of crime so high that the rational calculation no longer favors it. The most influential idea to emerge from right realism is the broken windows theory, introduced by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling in their landmark 1982 essay. The theory uses a powerful metaphor. If a broken window in a building is left unrepaired, it sends a signal to the community that no one is watching, no one cares, and no one is in charge. That signal invites further disorder. More windows get broken, graffiti appears, drug dealers move in. Eventually, serious crime follows. The lesson is that small signs of disorder, if left unchecked, will cascade into major criminality. Therefore, the solution is zero-tolerance policing, aggressively targeting minor offenses like vandalism, loitering, and public drinking before they create an environment where serious crime flourishes. The most famous real-world application of this theory was in New York City in the early 1990s under Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Police Commissioner William Bratton. Police began arresting people for jumping subway turnstiles, for aggressive panhandling, for public urination, and crime in New York dropped dramatically through the 1990s. Right realists pointed to this as proof of their theory. However, critics noted that crime was falling all across America at the same time, suggesting that economic factors and demographic changes may have played an equally or even more important role. Another major figure in right realism is the American sociologist Charles Murray, who argued in his controversial 1984 book Losing Ground that welfare dependency had created what he called an underclass, a segment of society trapped in a cycle of poverty, family breakdown, and criminality, not because of structural injustice, but because government welfare programs had perversely rewarded dysfunction and punished responsibility. Murray's argument was that generous welfare benefits made it economically rational for young men not to work and not to marry, which in turn destroyed the stabilizing influence of the family, leaving young people, particularly young men, without the moral anchoring they needed to stay out of crime. For Murray, the solution was not more government spending, but less, reducing welfare to restore personal responsibility and family structure. This argument remains deeply controversial and has been widely criticized for blaming the poor for their own poverty, but it had enormous influence on welfare reform policies in both the United States and the United Kingdom throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Left realism emerged in Britain during the 1980s largely as a response to two things: the rise of Thatcherite right-wing politics and a growing frustration within the left itself. Jock Young and his colleagues were tired of traditional left-wing criminology, which they felt romanticized criminals as heroic rebels against capitalism, while ignoring the devastating impact of street crime on working-class communities. Young coined a famous phrase for this tendency. He called it left idealism, and he was scathing about it. The left idealist, he argued, was so busy critiquing the capitalist state that they forgot to listen to the single mother in a council flat who was terrified of being mugged on her way home from work. Left realism said, we must take crime seriously, we must take victims seriously, and we must offer concrete solutions, not just theoretical critiques. The central explanatory concept in left realism is relative deprivation, borrowed originally from Robert Merton's strain theory, but developed with much greater sophistication by Young. Relative deprivation doesn't mean simply being poor. It means feeling poor relative to those around you, feeling that you are being denied what society has promised you and what you can see others enjoying. Think about it this way: a subsistence farmer in a remote village who has never seen a television and has no expectation of owning one does not feel relatively deprived. But a young man growing up in an inner-city neighborhood, surrounded by advertising for designer clothes and expensive trainers, watching wealthy lifestyles on social media, going to a school where university seems impossible and well-paid jobs seem unattainable, that young man feels acutely, painfully deprived relative to the society he is a part of, and that feeling of injustice, of being left behind, of being promised a life that will never materialize, creates a powerful motivation for crime. Not because he's evil, not because he's made a bad moral choice, but because the gap between what society promises and what it actually delivers has become unbearable. But left realism's most original and enduring contribution to criminology is its analytical framework known as the Square of Crime, developed by Jock Young and John Leah. Traditional criminology had always focused almost exclusively on two actors, the offender and the police. Left realism argued that this was hopelessly incomplete. To truly understand crime and to truly address it, you need to examine four interconnected actors simultaneously. First, the offender, who commits crime and why. Second, the victim, who suffers harm and how that harm is experienced in real communities. Third, the police and criminal justice system, how they respond, how they are perceived, and whether that perception builds or destroys community trust. And fourth, and most innovatively, the public and the local community, whose norms, values, and willingness to engage with institutions fundamentally shape the environment in which crime either flourishes or diminishes. These four actors form a square, and the relationships between them are dynamic and mutually reinforcing. For example, if the police are perceived by a community as racist or brutal, community members will stop cooperating with investigations. Without community cooperation, the police become less effective. Without effective policing, crime increases. Increased crime deepens community fear and distrust. The square becomes a vicious cycle. And crucially, left realism insists that you cannot break this cycle by focusing on only one corner. You must address all four simultaneously. In terms of practical solutions, left realism advocates for what it calls a multi-agency approach to crime prevention. This means that the responsibility for reducing crime cannot rest with the police alone. Schools must address the educational failures that funnel young people into criminality. Social services must address poverty, housing insecurity, and family breakdown. Urban planners must redesign neighborhoods to reduce the environmental conditions that facilitate crime. Community organizations must be empowered and funded to build social cohesion, and the police must be democratically accountable to the communities they serve, not enforcers of order imposed from above, but genuine partners in community safety. A concrete example: in the 1990s and 2000s, many British cities experimented with community safety partnerships, formal structures that brought together police, local councils, schools, health services, and voluntary organizations to coordinate crime prevention. Research showed that these partnerships, when properly resourced and genuinely collaborative, were effective at reducing both crime and the fear of crime, supporting the left realist framework. When we place right realism and left realism side by side, the contrast is stark and revealing. Right realism locates the cause of crime primarily within the individual, in their choices, their character, their moral formation, and their rational calculations about risk and reward. Its solutions are therefore largely punitive and control-based: more policing, harsher sentences, zero-tolerance policies, and the reduction of welfare dependency to restore personal responsibility. Left realism, by contrast, locates the primary cause of crime within the structural conditions of society, in inequality, relative deprivation, community breakdown, and the failure of institutions. Its solutions are therefore multidimensional and reform-based: address poverty, empower communities, reform policing, invest in education and social services. Importantly, though, both theories reject pure abstraction. Both insist on taking crime seriously as a real problem that harms real people. Both demand evidence-based practical responses. The difference lies in what they see when they honestly confront the evidence, and in what they believe a just and effective society owes to its most vulnerable. No theory is without its weaknesses. Right realism has been criticized for ignoring structural inequalities, for justifying discriminatory policing practices such as stop and search, and for producing policies like mass incarceration in the United States that have devastated communities of color without producing sustained reductions in crime. Critics also argue that the broken windows approach, rather than addressing the root causes of disorder, simply displaces poverty and marginalization out of view, making cities safer for the wealthy while criminalizing the poor for existing in public space. Left realism, meanwhile, has been criticized for sometimes being vague about how exactly its multi-agency solutions should be funded and implemented. Critics on the right argue that it still ultimately evades personal responsibility, and critics on the more radical left argue that it accepts the existing capitalist framework too uncritically, that by focusing on managing crime within the system, it fails to challenge the system itself that produces crime in the first place. These are real and serious criticisms, and any honest student of criminology must hold them in mind. So, where does this leave us? Crime is not a simple problem. It never has been. And anyone who tells you it is, anyone who says all we need is tougher sentences or all we need is more equality, is selling you a comfortable illusion. The truth is, as left realism and right realism together reveal, is that crime is born from the intersection of individual choices and social conditions. You cannot fully explain crime without understanding both the person who commits it and the worlds that shaped that person. You cannot build a genuinely safer society by choosing only one corner of the square. You need all four. You need offenders to face real consequences. You need victims to receive real support. You need communities to be genuinely involved in their own safety. And you need institutions, schools, police, governments, social services to operate with honesty, fairness, and deep accountability to the people they serve. The broken window is a symbol, but what it symbolizes is not just disorder on a street. It symbolizes a decision, a collective decision, about whether we're going to look after one another or abandon each other to the dark. That decision is made every day, in every community, by every government, and by every one of us. Criminology does not give us all the answers, but it gives us better questions. And better questions, honestly pursued, are how we begin to build a world where fewer windows are broken, and fewer lives are too.